morning.
These chairs are tricky.
Welcome to Primetime at the EU Library. Primetime is a celebration of the experiences and accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff, and is a collaborative project between the Friends of the EU Library, faculty development, and other offices on campus. If you enjoy the Primetime programming, please consider becoming a member of the Friends of the Library. Ask at the Research Assistant Desk for more information. Archive recordings, most of the Primetime presentations are in the BU Digital Library on the library website. Now, if you are you're invited to join us on Thursday, on November 30th at 11:15 a.m. when Ignorant Scholars Dr. Harley Schreck and Junior Sociocultural Reconciliation Studies Major Rita Mesticar share what has been learned over the 19-year history of the Bethel Frogtown Summit University Partnership, including the challenges and promises of building university-community relationships from both community and university perspectives. So today, we welcome Kent Gerber, who is the Digital Library Manager, as the moderator of a conversation with Ken Steinbach and Michelle Westmark Wingard from the Art and Design Department and Chris Gehrz of History, as they discuss the significance of public memory, monuments, and memorials.
Thanks everybody for coming before your Thanksgiving. It's very generous of you to come join us today. So first, here's the three parts that we're going to have today. So first, we'll just talk about why monuments and memorials in the first place and why now. And then next, Michelle and Ken and Chris will each sort of take their perspective as artists or historians. What is the significance? How do they engage with monuments and memorials? And lastly, we'll have a part where we just engage the issues and questions. What are some of the complicated issues and questions around these things? So first of all, so why are we here? So monuments, they can sometimes escape our notice, and we may casually notice that it's a plaque, a sculpture, a statue in a place where we're visiting, but we don't usually give it much thought. Sometimes monuments, they're clearly important to people. They stir up emotions, they stir up responses, and they're markers for memory, they're tools for conversation and conservation, and they communicate public values. So after this last summer's news of controversies around the art sculpture in the Walker sculpture garden called Scaffold, and the removing of several Confederate statues, those are some big controversies, and I was thinking, first of all, I'd like to get past just arguing about whether things go up or down. What else is going on with these things? I have some interesting thoughts, but also there are a lot of people who have been thinking about these for quite some time. So each of the panelists here have been thinking about it in their teaching, their scholarship. And so wouldn't it be great to have a conversation together about these and learn more? So they were all generous enough to take their time and have this conversation today. And so just also I wanted to point out, this is Michelle's work on some monuments in our home state of Minnesota, which I'll talk about a little bit. The Scaffold Monument in the Sculpture Garden, and then one example in New Orleans of one of the statues that was taken down. We'll talk about more of that later. But I also wanted to point out we have 3 monuments and memorials for you to notice or engage with today. Metanoia, that obelisk, is actually a monument or memorial of a kind. If you missed the portable monument in the front, it is now right there. And then also, Michelle has an exhibit out in the front, which is also centered on a memorial, amongst other things. So afterwards, I invite you to. So, without further ado, how do artists and historians engage with monuments and memorials? Michelle.
So we actually have our own removed monument here in Minnesota. There was, back in 1912, a monument to the largest execution by hanging in the United States that happened in Mankato, Minnesota. And it was actually removed in 1970, and in 1990 was lost, and it's now unknown. The whereabouts of this particular headstone are unknown. For years, this stone, matter-of-factly, marked the site of this execution, and the victims were simply a number. And naming is important. And so the fact that this was taken down, and you notice that at first it did have this sort of hallowed space. There's like a little little gate that kind of surrounds the memorial or monument marker. And then later on, it was in a gas station parking lot. And then at some point, it was taken down in the 90s, and there was a library on that site now. So as we got closer to the 150th anniversary of this occurrence, the city of Mankato took very seriously the fact that there needed to be something to mark this space. And so with collaboration with the Dakota community, they made something called Reconciliation Park, which is a park that's meant for people to gather. There's a limestone buffalo that, according to the website, symbolizes the spiritual survival of the Dakota people and honors their Dakota heritage in this area. And there's also a scroll that lists all of the names of all 38 who were executed at this site, both in their English name and their Dakota name, native name. So this is kind of an interesting way of thinking about what a monument looks like and what an object of contemplation can be. So in 2012, I started a journey to go to all of the significant sites that were two events of the U.S.-Dakota War in the state of Minnesota. There are 15 state-erected obelisks. There's many, many more markers that talk about specific incidents. But I tried to go to each of these sites as close to the anniversary of the event as possible. And I started to notice as I went to each of these places that each of the monuments has this kind of imposing size. All of them are much larger than the human form. But they don't require an action. You can walk around them, you can look at them, but it's simply a recounting of an event that is at a very specific time in history. So the Historical Society has actually started putting up placards that give a more inclusive version of each history, with the exception of New Ulm. And this is kind of the thing that started spurring on my interest in what do we do with monuments that have complicated retellings of history. So the one that's in New Ulm is situated in between the middle school and the courthouse. It's the only one of all of the places that I visited that does not have any kind of a plaque that tells the other side of the story. And it also refers to Native people as savages. So it started to get me wondering, what does it mean to have these monuments that don't necessarily make space for other voices? And that became an important part of the work that I was making. So I started making these kind of cutouts. These are three-dimensional. And depending on your perspective, these forms appear either as aggressive or impressive interruptions in the horizon line. And so I started to think about what would it mean if I actually removed these from the space but left this sort of shadow. And because these are three-dimensional, you have to stand in a very specific place. Otherwise, the horizon line doesn't actually line up, and much like, metaphorically, the stories. And so, as we think about these things as objects of contemplation and what it actually means to make space for absent narratives, I started looking at other monuments that were maybe a bit more contemporary. So this is Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial that's in Washington, D.C. And I started thinking more and more about what contemporary monuments or memorials ask of us. And oftentimes, they require action of some sort. So if you've been to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, you know that it requires of you that you have to actually walk into the earth and then walk out the other side. And Maya Lin talked about it as being this thing that required almost like the grieving process. You have to go into the depths of this thing and come out the other side and really feel it. And it also lists all of the names of those who lost their lives in the Vietnam War. And so starting to think about this idea of objects of contemplation versus acts of remembering. What does it mean to do an action in connection to these events? So I'll pass this along to Kevin.
Okay. I'm glad you started with the one slide, Ken, with all the protest information on there, because this piece, the scaffold piece by Sam Durant was actually the second version of the piece that was constructed. And so this was the first one that was in Germany at the documented exhibit in 2012. So you can actually see what it looked like at that time. The work is a combination of probably half a dozen different scaffolds that were used for mostly hangings in the United States. Michelle mentioned the one that was about, with the Dakota. John Brown, if any of you know John Brown, when he was hung, he's in here. There's a couple of anarchists from Chicago in the 1918 something. They were part of this as well. So this is the finished sculpture as it existed at that time. So the history of this object as it sort of made its way to the U.S. Is pretty, it's I don't know, it's complicated, but the Walker, Ogavisa went to document that she saw this piece, she thought it would be appropriate, invited Sam Durant to do it here. And that's when things started to get pretty interesting, because for me, as I started to think about this particular artwork, it's like, why did we never hear about any of this conversation when it was in Germany? Clearly a lot of this had to do with distance, a lot of it had to do with space. Perhaps somebody from the Dakota group, if they had gone there and seen this piece at, in Kassel, where it was, there might have been questions raised. But clearly what happened when they brought this thing and sort of dropped it in the midst of the Dakota community here in the U.S. and Minnesota, that's when things really blew up. And understandably so, because Sam Durant had very little contact, or virtually no contact. Ogavisa, the director of the Walker, had virtually no contact whatsoever with the Dakota community here. They just plunked this thing down, and here we go. And so that was, for me, the real disconnect in terms of how this thing sort of functioned and why it was. So for me, it kind of illustrates this pretty interesting point that space is really charged, and space really has a lot of context for us. And that's maybe some of the things to think about as as I'm going to show you a couple other images here. Another aspect of this thing that I might suggest, and I like how you phrase this, Michelle, about sort of objects of contemplation versus objects of memory? Actions of memory. Because I think one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking is that this object here, the sculpture right here, as it went from Germany to the US, actually slipped from being one of those objects into being the other one. It wasn't just a sculpture anymore, it became a monument once it became, once it was sort of here in this community, and it was contextualized around this. And so suddenly, it actually works quite well as a sculpture. It really does do a lot of the things that Sam Durant wanted it to do. However, when you put it in this context, the piece dramatically changes, it radically changes, and it becomes this monument experience, and you're commemorating things which should not be commemorated in that way. So it's a great piece, but he was just not the guy to do it, and this is not the place to have it. So back to these things. I've been having a lot of conversations with my class that produced this sculpture over here about proximity and what space means, how we understand space, what it means to have a sculpture in the front of a public square, what it means to have it in front of the universities, and the meaning of that, and what it means to have like this kind of a monument. Maybe a way to think about this is if these monuments were indeed in cemeteries or if they were in museums, we'd never be having any of these conversations. It's like the location of where these things actually are is really powerful, and the context around that really evokes a lot. One of the conversations about when these monuments were put into community is also a pretty charged one too, because we always refer to these as Civil War memorials. It's like these are Civil War memorials. And I'm not quite sure that that's actually correct. I would say maybe that the subject is the Civil War, in the same way that when a painter makes a portrait, the subject of the portrait is that individual, but how they paint it, like that's the content. And so I would say like the content of these things is so far away from being about the Civil War. It's about a different kind of a context. It's about recontextualizing the Civil War. It's about understanding it in a different way. There's a great graph you might have seen us put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center about when all of these memorials and monuments were put up. And the great majority were put up like about 40 to 60 years after the Civil War. And an interesting thing starts to happen in situations like this. I'm going to maybe jump a little far afield and show you two examples. George Washington, left and right, founder of the nation. The sculpture on the left was actually commissioned during Washington's lifetime. The artist, Houdon, was the artist I knew the work, but I didn't know the piece. And it's a life-size portrait. Washington was around, so Houdon went to Washington, literally made measurements of his face, made drawings of his whole body and whatnot, and created a portrait on the left, which is very very human, isn't it? It's a human Washington. He's a real guy. There's a lot of symbolism, sort of the way that they would make sculptures during that time, that would be carved in a way. Washington, for example, has a walking staff, and all of his articles of warfare, the sword on this side over here, he's discarded those because now he's a man of peace. And so this is Washington as an individual, this is Washington as a human, the great leader certainly, but he's a guy, you could sort of meet this person. On the other hand, this other work, which is about 40 years later, this sculpture is actually 13 feet tall. Wow, so if I'm standing next to this, I'm like this tall right here. So it's like really monumental. It's really changed. And I think that this is maybe another example of kind of what I'm talking about here. There has been a revision of Washington, how we understand him, how we look at him, what he means to our community, what he means to our, for us in terms of historical, the one on the left, he's the man with ideas. He is the great leader. The one on the right, he's become a symbol. And that's very much what's happening with these things right here, is that they're really not about the Civil War. They're about reinterpreting the Civil War and contextualizing this and putting it into community in a way that that says something else. They're far more about what was actually going on in the context of socially what's going on. And a lot of civil unrest, a lot of civil rights things were happening, and so a lot of these were put up in response to those kinds of situations. I did put this one in there. Anyone know what this is? Ground Zero. About 8 years after 9/11, there was a proposal to build a mosque about 2 blocks away from Ground Zero, and this was the actual design for the mosque. And so this is maybe not so isolated from, it's like easy to talk about Civil War because we're all Northerners, most of us are Northerners here, and it's a little bit more abstract. I'd like to put this one out here because it complicates it a little bit more for me. It's like when thinking about this site, the 9/11 site, when the mosque was pitched to the city of New York, it was actually approved on one level. It's like the city approved it almost like 29-1, I think they approved it was the final vote for this. But when it sort of got out into the media and the larger national conversation, suddenly everything blew up. And it's like, you can't possibly do this. And so I think it's another situation where, proximity in space is, maybe I'd say it's a real demonstration of how proximity in space has meaning. Like, what does it mean to have this mosque that close to 9/11 as opposed to 6 blocks further away, which is, I think, was where it was not this structure, but a similar one was actually built. And I like that complicated question because those complicated questions are kind of revealing. Another way I want to maybe talk about this is a memorial or kind of a monument that is in London, in Trafalgar Square. If you've been there, you know that there's a gigantic, sort of one of those tall sculptures, not unlike the Civil War monument I showed earlier with Lord Nelson. He's a famous British leader, and he's standing on top of this very large plinth that he's there. Lord Nelson, by the way, only has one arm because blown off in a battle or something. And there's 4 of these plinths that are kind of spread around. Over time, 3 of them have gotten filled up, and there's one that's sort of a naked plinth like this. So there was nothing on it. So about twice a year, the City of London awards an artist an opportunity to do something on the plinth. And so this was actually a piece by an artist named Mark Quinn, his approach to this. And so you've got this whole structure, kind of evoking monument, kind of evoking all of these issues of space and whatnot. And Mark Quinn, in this particular piece, he chooses to commemorate somebody. And the individual he chooses to commemorate is a woman named Alison Lapper. Alison Lapper was a victim of thalidomide poisoning, or thalidomide. It's like women back in the 50s and 60s would take thalidomide for morning sickness, and they found out very quickly that it caused horrible birth defects. And so Alison Lapper was one of these individuals. And she's pregnant. And so this is actually a depiction of what Alison Lapper kind of looked like in Mark Quinn's introduction to the piece that he had created for this object. And I like talking about this one because this is maybe a more positive way of thinking about, well, what do we do with all these public spaces? Like, how do we deal with these plinths? What do we do with all of these monuments? How do we sort of approach this? And I really love sort of the fourth plinth sculpture, and this one in particular, because this is such a contrast to virtually everything else that we see on top of these plinths, everywhere. First of all, it's a woman. It's an imperfect woman. It's a pregnant woman, and it's very monumental. And there's just so many terrific contrasts here, and yet it's very, very life affirming. And there's qualities about the figure that I think are quite powerful in the way that it kind of looks backward and responds to memory, but yet, so maybe some of the conversation with what you were talking about, Michelle, responds to memory, but also it's an action that allows us to sort of look forward to. So it's a piece that is very affirming, but it kind of looks into this tradition of the plinth and the figure on the pedestal for a lot of that energy, but it reinterprets it, reinvents it, moving forward into another conversation. So that's a bit of 2 or 3 different ideas to toss out, and maybe this is a way of starting some questions and conversation.
Okay. So I'm the historian on the panel, but like most historians, I brushed up often against memory without thinking very hard about what memory was, either for an individual or for a collective of any sort. And then all of a sudden in 2012, I thought a lot about memorials about the same time as you were doing your work. I got to scout out the World War I trip that we take to Europe every other day term. And especially as we got to the former Western Front in Flanders and the region of the Somme in France, our tour guide, a guy from Belgium named Carl, was just masterful in unpacking the obelisks that you see everywhere, because those are the division memorials for the British Army. The statues, the kind of monumental structures, but also how do you read a cemetery, were a really big part of the trip. And every time, and we've gone back 3 times now, becomes more and more meaningful. So I've actually done a presentation here about that trip, so I'm not going to try to take you through the whole thing. But I thought I'd kind of show you the beginning, middle, and end of what memorials look like. And so this, I'm sure will, the little ideas that these two have already talked about, it's a little different in the sense that it's Europe. So I consciously want to not talk about American memorials for a while. It's about war, but it's a kind of war that no one celebrates. Right? There's almost no temptation among anyone in the war to use this as an occasion to put up triumphant martial statues of generals and admirals. You can find them if you look hard, but that's not how they do it. So where the class actually starts is at Trafalgar Square. We start there because that's where the British gather to celebrate the beginning of the war. And we read Bertrand Russell, the pacifist philosopher, kind of astonished that people are actually much more depraved than he thought they were. They celebrated destruction and sending their kids off to the trenches. And we talk about the forest plinth. And we talk about how it's juxtaposed with these kind of statues of the empire and military glory. The second time we were there was actually a blue rooster that now resides in the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden, right? And so there's often kind of an absurd kind of contrast. But the first memorial we actually see is this one. So we stay at a hostel near the Tower of London. And on Tower Hill, you come to the Merchant Marine Memorial. And I like this partly because the nature of World War I, it's a war of economic survival. And Britain can only stay in the war so long as it can feed itself. And so, something like 15,000 sailors give their lives to try to escort these ships across the Atlantic Ocean, and this is the memorial in the mid-1920s that the British put up. It's done primarily by an architect named Edwin Lutyens, who's the most famous British architect of memorials. He does one other we'll see here, plus a grand monumental intersecting arch called Thiepval in France that we visit. So one thing this illustrates is there's a sense of this was a world historical moment. And so how do you do something that isn't faddish? How do you do something that's going to stand the test of time? Well, you turn back to older ways of remembering, and that's why obelisks are so popular. But in this case, you get something like a Greek temple. But then we had a few other distinctive elements. So names, as Michelle mentioned, become very important at most memorials. And names of otherwise anonymous, these are seamen. And these are people who drown in the North Sea when U-boat attacks. They're organized by ship, not alphabetically, not by year. And so, of course, all our students want to find the Lusitania, which is kind of up in a corner somewhere. It's hard to find. But then also, it's a living memorial. People still visit this, and they tend to leave the poppies, which is this ubiquitous symbol of originally World War I memory, but now kind of Commonwealth memory. We have a couple of Canadian colleagues who probably this month wore a poppy on Remembrance Day. So we start there, and then we eventually get to the front. And one thing that strikes me about the front is you do see sculpture. And again, if you want to, you can find generals. So for example, a little south of Trafalgar Square in Whitehall is a statue of Lord Haig, the most famous British general of the war, which no one really likes because some people are offended at the very notion of celebrating Haig, the butcher of the Somme. And people who like Haig thinks the statue is too somber. I mean, it's not glorious enough. Just north of Trafalgar is a statue of Edith Wharton, the British nurse who was arrested as a spy by the Germans and executed at dawn. And so there's a statue of her. But if you actually visit the front, the statues you see tend, first of all, to be fairly abstract. So, for example, this is Wingard Cemetery. It's one of the German military cemeteries in Belgium. And it's by far the most moving place we visit. Now, part of the deal the Germans struck with the Belgians and French is they could bury their dead where they fell. But the British and the Belgians and French didn't want this to become a kind of pilgrimage site of German nationalism. And so for the most part, they're very low to the ground, but they're allowed one sculpture at each site. And in the mid-1920s, the Weimar Republic tended to commission modernist artists, in this case Emil Krieger, who is a sculptor from Munich, who designed a set of 4, mostly soldiers, one is a medic. And they simply stand there gazing out at a mass grave, the Kameradengrab, where 40,000 soldiers are buried. And if you catch it on the right day, like if it's raining, it looks like they've been crying the whole time. You just see their features. And they stand in then for the entire, all these Kameraden, all these German soldiers who had fought and died. And behind them are the names of all the unidentified dead. And then the second image I have here is from the Vimy National Canadian Memorial. So Canada in the late 1930s got to make its national memorial, and it picked a spot in northern France called Vimy, where in April 1917 they fought off the Germans. And so they put the memorial at the top of the ridge where they had fought back the German advance. And it's enormous. I'm not even showing you, a tenth of it here, but the most famous image is probably this statue. This is Mother Canada. And she's grieving, and she's gazing down, and below her is a kind of is a stand-in for all the soldiers, a soldier lying at rest, and then the names of all the Canadians who died. And so this is Canada grieving for her fallen children. But behind her are some other statues, one of which represents the passage from Isaiah of swords being turned into plowshares. And so it's a fascinating memorial because it's nationalistic, right? This is Canada breaking free from Britain, asserting its own identity, but it's also pacifistic, which we don't tend to put those two ideas together, but that's how the Canadians choose to remember the war. And this year was a really important year. This was the 100th anniversary of Vimy, and so Canadians flocked here to see Vimy. We end the trip then in Munich because we want to talk about connections with National Socialism. Hitler goes to Munich after the war and takes leadership of the Nazi Party. We go to Dachau and we talk about art, but we also visit the Bavarian War Memorial. And here again we see a statue. This is the sleeping soldier by Bernhard Licher. He's not dead, he is schlafende Soldat, he is sleeping. And that's important because he's buried in a kind of pyre in front of the Bavarian state government. So he is down inside there. Now, a lot of this was destroyed during American bombing in World War II, so there used to be names of all the dead, and the Americans wouldn't let them restore it. And for a time, the sleeping soldier was actually back on the other side of the Hofgarten in the Odeonsplatz, a big public square where the Germans had celebrated the start of the war, and the Nazis had put him there as part of a nationalistic memorial. And the Americans refused to let the sleeping soldier stay there. The Americans ran the military government of Bavaria. And so this became a kind of contested site of memory. And so instead, they relocated to this relatively anonymous place. The first time I visited, it was kind of dusk. And with a kind of sandy color, I couldn't even find it. I walked past it 3 times without noticing. It's in the sunken garden in this public park. But the main reason I included it here is I don't think you can probably see, but inscribed on here are the German words as "Sie werden auferstehen." And when I first saw that, being a good pietistic Christian, I thought, oh, it says they will be resurrected. And then I thought about it some more, and it actually more literally translates to "they will rise again." And I don't know if you can see the 19th century warrior, or actually medieval warrior behind, but there is a sense of you put the "they will rise again" with the sleeping soldier, and you can see why the American occupiers were a little bit nervous about keeping this memorial here. So Ken mentioned the really important idea that when you see a statue like this, this is not actually about World War I. Right? In my classes, I often suggest we need to distinguish between history and the past. The past are events that happened, but they can't be rerun. They can't really be recovered. History is just a way of interpreting them, but memory is a way of interpreting them too. And so I often have my students read this passage from the late British historian Tony Judd. This is from his book about Europe after World War II. Unlike memory, which confirms and reinforces itself, history contributes to the disenchantment of the world. Most of what it has to offer is discomforting, even disruptive. And I like the word disenchantment. In a sense, memorials are trying to enchant you. They're trying to cast a spell over you. You're supposed to come into their presence, and by the brilliance of the sculpture, the placement, just the inherent emotion of it, they're supposed to take you out of reality. And they're supposed to, we'll talk more about, maybe get you to worship a certain something. And so I think the challenge for historians, and the reason I think a lot of us are uncomfortable with these, is our job is to disenchant you. I mean, our job is to talk to Germans about the problems inherent in the way that they're remembering right here. Talk to the British about the problems that might be inherent in the way they remember as well. And so as a historian, that's one of the challenges I wrestle with, because I think they're actually very teachable locations, but they're inherently problematic.
All right, so that's each of just an overview. And when we were talking before, there's so many different directions this conversation could go, and so much of what's in all of these. So that's just covering the surface. But so maybe we can try to, what are some complicated issues and questions that cross all of these situations? So I think we covered this a lot, but maybe if you want to just revisit that a little bit, what is the significance of the fact that it's, at least the ones in the news, were public space? And that location. So
maybe I'll start. I think I actually did put a photo in. Can you just look at that?
Yeah.
So by far the most famous British memorial of the war is called the Cenotaph, which is Evelyn Lutyens. It was originally a temporary kind of plaster structure, and it was so popular you redid it in stone. And it stands in Whitehall, which is the street leading from Trafalgar down to, you see the Houses of Parliament, Big Ben, Westminster Abbey. So this is the heart of British government. And it's a fascinating work because there's almost nothing on it. You see the wreath, on one side it says the glorious dead, on the other side it says 1914 to 1918, and then you've got flags of the different military services of Britain. And every Remembrance Sunday you get a parade processing past this. So now this encompasses all of Britain's wars, not just World War I. And it's in the middle of a road. So first of all, it's actually meant to force your attention. You can't just go past this. There's actually a stoplight there, and there's a crosswalk, and you have to at least notice it, unlike many other memorials. But I mean, the reason that's so striking is it's right in the middle of the center of British power. You know, on one side is the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defense is up the street, 10 Downing Street is around the corner, the Houses of Parliament are right down there. And my favorite description of this comes from American historian Jay Winter at Yale, who wrote a book called Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, about World War I remembrance. So this is what he wrote about the Cenotaph. It's a form on which anyone can inscribe his or her own thoughts, reveries, sadnesses. It became a place of pilgrimage and managed to transform the commemorative landscape by making all of official London into an imagined cemetery. So the placement of it in this spot, in the public, in the middle of throbbing political, economic, military heart of not just the city, but the British Empire, essentially turns the city and the British Empire into a cemetery. This is the unknown soldier. This is like the Eternal Flame at Arlington or the Arc de Triomphe. And so you walk past it and you're reminded constantly of the war. So it's very effective in that way. But I think he's also right that because it is so abstract, he was simply aspiring to geometry here. You can make of it whatever you want. So Ken showed a couple of statues of George Washington. Interestingly, as soon as Washington dies, there's a debate in the early republic about how to remember a founding father. The Federalists want something monumental. Actually propose a ziggurat, a big pyramid, right, to stand in Washington, in the city named for Washington. And the Democratic Republicans are horrified at this. They feel like, why are we borrowing from these old monarchical absolutist structures? We should have a good democratic egalitarian kind of commemoration. And one congressman proposed what we should do is put a kind of marble kind of scroll somewhere in the Capitol that would have nothing written on it. And so citizens could walk by and they could mentally write on the scroll whatever they want to make of Washington's life. And of course, we decided ultimately that's not sort of the noblest stuff. But I think that's kind of the meaning of the cenotaph. This is like an uninscribed scroll that you write your meaning of the war on. And so this was controversial because it doesn't have any religious imagery on it. Lutyens wanted to do something that fit a religiously plural empire for whom Hindu and Muslim and Jewish and atheist soldiers fought, not just Christians. But I always tell my students, cenotaph is Greek for empty tomb. So whenever I walk by it, I think of the resurrection. But when other people walk by it, they think of something very different. And so that's my best example of how having a public space complicates but maybe deepens the meetings.
Okay. I think I'm going to move on to a different question, just so, and I know Michelle, one of the questions that was important to you was like, how does an effective monument or memorial require, what does it require? So how's it effective, what does it require of the viewers? So, maybe we can get back to that in a moment.
Okay, so in Susan Sontag's book regarding the pain of others, she says that compassion is an unstable emotion. It needs to be translated into action or it withers. And so I think for me, one of the most effective ways of memorials existing is either a place that allows for an action of significance or that requires of viewers some sort of action of significance. So I wanted to mention that I went to all of these different historic sites to the US-Dakota War as close to or on each of the significant dates. And I never ran into anybody in any of the places. There was like maybe one or two people in Camp Release Park when I was there the day that occurrence happened. And then on December 26th, I went to Mankato to the hanging site of the 38. And on that day, some of you might be aware of this, there's actually a ride that takes place in commemoration of the 38 that starts in South Dakota and is 330 miles on horseback all the way to Mankato. And the riders arrive at 10 o'clock in the morning on December 26th when the hanging occurred. And there's a large group of people there to greet the riders. And I went one year, and my daughter was actually really teeny, so I had to bring her with me. And she was strapped to my chest, and I had my camera with me. And I was just expecting that I would be taking pictures when the riders came in. And it was a particularly cold day, so there's this kind of breath of the collective crowd kind of rising up. And all of a sudden, just moments before 10 o'clock, the ground starts to shake. And you can just feel the energy of all of these horses' hooves as they are coming down the main street towards the buffalo sculpture. And at that particular moment, I just realized I wasn't going to take any pictures. So I took just a couple there, and they're blurry because I was just so overcome with the emotion of that experience. But it was remarkable to me that in all of these visiting of really in the 50, 60 locations, this is the first time that I actually felt this overwhelming emotional state. Was the fact that there's all these people here and there's this action that's translating into remembrance. So I think that was something that I walked away from, is that remembering is an action.
So, and I think, would you like to talk a little bit about sort of what the process was for this monument? So what makes an effective monument, or it's mobile, so what's that about?
Thank you for the opportunity. The portable monument is a collaborative work with me and 6 of the sculpture students from my Sculpture 1 class. And it is a genuinely collaborative object. And we were thinking a lot about some of these issues that I was talking about briefly earlier about proximity of power and what it means to put something in a different location, the power that it generates from that location. And so we created a monument that's, I mean, on the one hand, there's a certain humor about it. It's this big kind of concrete-looking thing on wheels, and you can move it around. So it embraces the idea of paradox and humor clearly. But it is a lot about maybe asking some questions. Maybe I would say it's a piece that asks questions as opposed to making a big statement. And that was a challenge for us because we had things that we really wanted to dig into with this issue, like why are these things being taken down, what are the conversation, but realizing too that we actually did want to start a conversation. We didn't want to just sort of get in, make a hit, make a big statement, and then get out, because there's so much of that now. It's like maybe we could approach the conversation in a different way to maybe open it up into like what does it mean when you have a monument that's in the public square as opposed to in the BC or as opposed to in the library or something else. So that was the goal, is to maybe allow people to ask some questions that would generate some kind of conversation.
See, we're getting close to time. So what do you feel about, does anybody have any questions from the audience that you have about this issue that you have the opportunity to hear from? Yeah.
What do you think happens at that 30-40-year mark?
I'm just going to repeat. So just ask, what do you think happens at that 30-year mark?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know why. I noticed that too, but like 40 years after the Civil War is when all those things up. Yeah, I don't know.
That's essentially when the headstone was put up in Mankato too, 1912.
Well, I don't know. In the case of the Civil War monuments, it's Jim Crow. Essentially it's to enshrine white supremacy.
Yes.
I mean, it's a famous case is the one in New Orleans, the memorial that got taken down. It's actually during Reconstruction, kind of white militia rebels against the Reconstructionist government. So the memorial is to that militia. And it actually names white supremacy as an enshrined principle of the state. So I think that's what's been interesting to historicize these a little bit. They're really not about the Civil War. They're about taking the South back from Reconstruction, about rebuilding a not multiracial society. But I don't know if there's a more universal principle about why things happen. I don't know.
Well, how can people respond to monuments or memorials that are there? And maybe if they're permanent or semi-permanent, or sometimes the option is to take it down, sometimes the option is to leave it. Well, what are other options? Or you've spoken about some of the things that Michelle, your work addresses that. Chris, I know you mentioned something that they did at Richmond.
I can't say a lot more about it. We're pretty behind this. Kevin Levin's a good person to read on this. He's a Civil War historian. He's written a lot since 2015 about Civil War commemoration, Confederate memorials. So Richmond, as the capital of the Confederacy, has all sorts of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson statues. But rather than getting rid of them, what they've instead tried to do is to enrich the commemorative landscape, I think is the language the city government uses, by having civil rights memorials instead. And so, in a sense, they put them in conversation with each other. In a sense, they undercut the kind of power of the lost cause imagery that goes with Confederate memorials by showing here's the actual triumph, or at least a partial triumph of what happens in the 50s and 60s. So, I mean, that's controversial. I mean, New Orleans decided not to do that. They decided that that's destined to fail if you leave those other kinds of memorials out. But that was Richmond's solution, at least.
And your work has talked a little bit about, I mean, you notice the obelisks, some have varieties and some don't, or you want to talk a little bit?
Some of them do have plaques that have recontextualized the story of the U.S. Dakota War, and have started actually talking to Dakota people about what their understanding of history is. And so much of the work that I was doing was in an effort to try to make space for other voices. And I think that when it comes down to it, I think listening to the other voices that might have insights that we haven't heard before, I think is incredibly important. And in fact, I did have a little thing on the Dakota 38 slide. If you're not familiar with that story or with the ride, There's actually a really amazing documentary called The Dakota 38, and it's on YouTube. You can watch it for free, and it's about this ride that's been happening since 2005. It'll happen again this year. I think it starts at the very beginning of December. They ride 330 miles, stop at churches, people feed them, and it documents the whole journey and why it started to begin with. There's also a relay race that starts, a relay run that starts from Fort Snelling all the way to Mankato that very same day. So there's a lot of actions that are happening. I think being aware of those and why they're important is worth knowing.
And can I just give you a chance to chime in, or can I know? Well, go ahead if you have a response.
I do. Given infinite power, time, and space, I would probably, suggest more like the Richmond solution. Which is a counterbalance history. Although, I think it's worth noting that, something in the center of a public square, if you're not affected by that, that means that you're in alignment with that. It's not a passive object. It's not a passive experience for a lot of people that are walking past it. So I think some of those actually do need to be, just moved. I'm not a big fan of taking things down, for most reasons. But I think, like proximity, space really is power. And I think that, a counterbalancing argument, but also some thoughtful adjustments of some of those things.
All right, well, and then Chris, I know you put.
Well, if we have time to talk about it.
Yeah. So by the way, feel free to be on top of the portable monuments here. You can do that. We'll be here. Take a selfie.
Stairs for now.
Take a selfie.
Limited amount of stairs, right? Any other last chance? Any questions? One.
Do you have examples of when monuments have been plugged into a museum?
So the question was, do you have examples of when monuments were moved from one place into a museum?
Well, the one in Mankato was moved, and it was initially it was supposed to go somewhere else, but then it was actually stolen and or maybe not stolen, might not be acquired and relocated, and that location is not known.
It's not really in the same vein, but a local version of this. I don't know if you've ever been to the McNamara Alumni Center at U of M. So if you go in, you'll see the gate to the old Memorial Stadium. So the state's World War I memorial was the football stadium. Right? They actually had a big debate about this. They thought about doing something by the state capitol in St. Paul, but instead they actually decided that the most democratic way to celebrate America's role in the war was to do something connected to education, because that was more hopeful, and to do something that was useful. So this is really popular for World War II. It's called the Living Memorial. They're trying to break with European grandiosity. But there are a couple of examples from World War I, and they're often sports stadiums. There's a swimming pool in Honolulu. Lots of, Soldiers Field in Chicago is an example of this. But U of M got a new football stadium in 1925. Of course, time moved on. We tore it down. They moved to the Metrodome, and so they did preserve then the gates that remembers the original purpose of it. And so if you go to McNamara, you can see that in a sense it has then been enshrined in a kind of museum. You'd really have to know to look for it, and I'm not sure how many.
Yeah, so it would be email.
But it is documented in a digital exhibit as well. Well, I think any last words. But should we say, is there a difference between monument and memorial? Is that should that be an important distinction? Or?
I think that's I don't know that we have an answer, but I think that there's certainly different ways of thinking about the way things function as either monument or memorial.
Actually, you said you had a slide about that a little bit, right? Like what a memorial.
Maybe. I mean, in the context of our story, a memorial reflects, I guess, could be a monument, but it's anything that, in the context of World War I, it's about their dead. I think one thing to think about what I'm talking about is it's so intimately connected with bereavement, loss, mourning. That's the prevailing spirit of almost everything you see. And so it almost gets like everything becomes a memorial, but a monument doesn't necessarily have to serve that function. So in a sense, like the Canadian beanie is a memorial, but it's also a monument to Canada, right? It's, I don't know, I mean, at least in the context of our course, that's how we draw the distinction.
I think we're just about it. Any last? No. Thank you all for coming. Thank you guys.